Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. M-11.Banerjee. I am Professor of Sociology at the University of Burdwan. In this module, we will study anti-globalization movements. This module forms part of the paper on social movements. Why should we study social movements? For the sociologist, studying social movements is of great importance because social movements either lead to social change or they resist social change. Globalization is a social process, but there have been fierce resistance to this process, and that is what we will study. If globalization is the free movement of goods and services from one part of the world to another, then globalization has been with us since the dawn of civilization. The Indus Valley people, for example, they traded with Mesopotamia, they traded with Arabia, they even migrated and settled in Mesopotamia. Then what distinguishes the present stage of globalization? The present stage of globalization is marked by corporate capitalism. It is based on market forces. Its philosophy is neoliberalism. The anti-globalization movement or counter-globalization movement is a social movement critical of the globalization of corporate capitalism. It is a collection of many different organizations, individuals, and loose coalitions of both individuals and organizations. Before we proceed further, let us first formally define globalization. The businessdictionary.com defines globalization as, quote, the worldwide movement towards economic, financial, trade, and communication integration. The philosophy behind globalization is neoliberalism. While the old liberalism preached that the state should not interfere in economic activities, the neoliberals preach that the state should withdraw from all economic and welfare activities and leave people to fend for themselves in the marketplace. The model preached by the advocates of neoliberalism is globalization, marketization, privatization. Now, we will discuss the anti-globalization movement. So what is the anti-globalization movement? It is an effort to counter the perceived negative aspects of the current process of globalization. The anti-globalization movement is opposed to neoliberalism and international institutions that promote neoliberalism. What are these institutions? These are the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Trade Organization. That apart, there are neoliberal free trade agreements like North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, and the General Agreement on Trade in Services. Now let's look at the nature of the anti-globalization movement. In other words, what is anti-globalization movement? For Bachmann, the nature of anti-globalization movement is diverse, and there exists a great deal of disagreement on the name of the movement. It has been named by various social scientists as anti-globalization movement. It is claimed that it is a media-driven label. It is therefore also labeled as anti-capitalist movement, the global justice movement, the civil society movement, the alternative globalization movement, or the movement against global corporatism. Bachmann defined anti-globalization movements as a loose association of various groups which attempt to redefine the societal values about economic growth, socio-economic equality, and the relations of individuals to one another and their natural environment. Let's now trace the origins of the anti-globalization movements. We may trace it back to the 1970s. Before we continue, we should note that the term globalization itself is of recent origin. It has been used since 1990s. Prior to that, there were other terms like neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, etc. Now, immediately after the states, some states like India, Egypt, Indonesia, and others, they were liberated from colonial yoke. They formed an independent movement known as non-aligned movement. This non-aligned movement maintained equal distance between two blocks, that is the Western Bloc or the NATO and the Soviet bloc. And the feminist movement was born in the USA, in the Western countries, where women's lib and bra burning became the order of the day. We also find that concerns for environment growing. The first United Nations Environment Summit was held in Stockholm in 1975. We also see the birth of the first green parties like in Australia and New Zealand in 1972. Continuing our search for the origins of anti-globalization movements, we may note that 500 years ago, the West began their quest to conquer the world. The discoveries of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Captain Cook vastly changed the Western perception of the world as it was. And after the explorers came in, when the conquerors. Engler traces the roots of the movement through a 500-year-old history of resistance against European colonialism and US imperialism. We may note that the Spanish conquistadors, they destroyed the civilizations of the South America. And in India, the Portuguese became such a menace during the reign of Emperor Shah Jahan that he had to take military action against them. So these were some examples. This was an example of resistance to the imperialists. But the most significant moment of origin for the movement was the uprising of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Chiapas, Mexico on January 1, 1994. The Zapatista Army eschewed traditional methods of hierarchical leadership. It used the internet to spread, to criticize capitalism and through a network of international supporters. Now, the first stirrings of the anti-globalization movement may be traced to 1980s. In that decade, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund became the focus of large-scale protest. Especially important was the Narmada Dam and the transmigration project of the Suharto regime. The Narmada Bachao Andolan was directed against the submergence of large-scale areas of land, and but ultimately it could not be a success. To smoothen the process of globalization, the metropolitan powers like the USA, the UK, France, Spain, etc., they engaged in repeated negotiations and agreements, like the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, we will call it MI, the new round of global trade negotiations by the World Trade Organization in Seattle in December 1999. But these meetings became the focus of anti-globalization protests. My especially was the target of a huge campaign, and a bold new era in the anti-globalization debate began with the massive opposition to the global trade negotiations at Seattle. Now, we will further discuss the protest campaigns. Say in Washington, a huge protest took place during the meeting of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in April 2000. In Chiang Mai, again, a meeting of the Asian Development Bank in May 2000 was the target of protests. In Quebec City, in April 2001, in a summit of Americas, again became the target of protest. And again in Gothenburg, a European Union summit in June 2001 was targeted by protesters. The largest protest was in Genoa, in Italy, in July 2001, against the Group of Eight meeting. There has been a series of anti-globalization movements, as reflected in the protests against the World Economic Forum, World Trade Organization, World Summit on Sustainable Development. Now, let us discuss the approaches within the anti-globalization movement. Firstly, we will discuss briefly the Fair Trade or Back to Bretton Woods School. It argues for the immediate reform of the world's trading system like the World Bank, IMF and WTO. Next is the Localization School. It argues for the abolition of the institutions which were mentioned earlier and outright winding of globalization. Now, let's look at the major concerns of the anti-globalization movement. The contributions of two Irish-born activists, Bob Geldof and Bone, has enabled the anti-globalization movement to stress on the burning issues of the day like human rights, social justice and poverty, AIDS, women's rights and environmental sustainability, says Dillon. The major concerns of the movement are: 1. Firstly, democracy. The movement aims to protect the democratic control of the ordinary people and claims that the neoliberal policies of free trade, privatization, and open markets should be left at the democratic disposal of the developing countries and should not be forced by the rich nations. Labor and social reproduction. The key concern of the movement is the substance of what gets pursued by the neoliberalizers. Human rights. The movement is concerned with the human rights of those in social reproduction, for labor or for communities in their own environments, especially indigenous people who are faced by the power of big states and large-scale capital. Human health and environment. The movement is also concerned about food security, health risks, genetically modified crops, the privatization of water and patenting, development. The movement is concerned with the issues of development and especially in the developing countries. Now, let's look at one of the major institutions against globalization, that is the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum emerged as a response to the growing international movements to neoliberal globalization and the effects of the neoliberal economic policies prevalent in most of the countries. The World Social Forum was conceived as an open meeting place for deepening the reflection, the democratic discussion of ideas, the formulation of proposals, the free exchange of experiences, and the articulation of civil society organizations and movements that are opposed to neoliberal globalization and the domination of the world by capital and by any other form of imperialism. The first edition of the World Social Forum was organized in Porto Alegre, Brazil from January 25 to 30, 2001. It was attended by approximately 20,000 people. They comprised delegates from 117 countries, youth camp, and indigenous nation camp participants. In order to facilitate international articulation of the organization's processes, the International Council of the World Social Forum was established in 2001. The International Council was mandated to enhance and expand the diversity of the World Social Forum processes at the global level. Now, let's look at the function of the International Council of the World Social Forum. The International Council is a group of international networks from different regions of the world. It is constituted by several organizations working in areas including economic justice, human rights, environmental issues, labor issues, youth and women's rights. The International Council contributes to the World Social Forum methodology, its outreach communication strategies, as well as the local and regional organization processes. Now, how is World Social Forum related to India? Well, the activities of the World Social Forum processes in India was initiated in early 2002. It was designated to set up and build a World Social Forum process in the country towards hosting the Asian Social Forum meeting in Hyderabad in 2003. It was conceived as a symbol of unity and democratic space for people to assert their rights for peace and a world free of violence, prejudice, and hatred. The World Social Forum India process not only focused on imperialist globalization but also on the issues of religious and sectarian violence, casteism, and patriarchy. Now we will discuss a very important recent movement in the anti-globalization struggle, and that is the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement emerged as a product of the political mobilization against the excesses of global capitalism. The Occupy movement started on September 17, 2011 in Zuccotti Park, New York City, and has since then spread globally. The distinguishing feature of this movement is that it is a leaderless opposition movement. It includes people of many colors, genders, and political persuasions. The movement generated awareness on the issues of global inequality and strived to educate and encourage people around the slogan, "We are 99%." The slogan entails the entire philosophy of members of the movement. It focuses on income inequality, income distribution, and the economic consequences of the financial system. The Occupy movement emerged as a product of the political mobilization against the excesses of capitalism. The protesters gained initial success when they took over and maintained occupancy of the Zuccotti Park, the park owned by the corporate giants. The movement slowly came to be known as Occupy Wall Street and created a stir in many of the financial centers of capitalism around the world. Now, let's look at the composition of the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement consisted of a radically religiously and economically diverse crowd. It comprised of students, unemployed, graduates, laid-off middle-aged professionals, and skilled workers, and all other older-aged individuals. These people raised their voices against the prevailing ills of global capitalism. Before we conclude, let us summarize what we have learned. We have seen that globalization is as old as human civilization. The people of the Indus Valley traded with the people of Mesopotamia. They traded with Arabia. If globalization means free trade and movement of goods and services, then globalization was present during the days of Indus Valley civilization. Then we also find how religious globalization has taken place during Ashoka's time. Buddhism spread to so many places, to Sri Lanka, to Tibet, to China, to Indonesia, and all the places. But globalization, inspired by the West, led by the West, started 500 years ago, when the great voyages of discovery were made. Christopher Columbus, there is a saying, the American school children learn. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And where did the Columbus go? He wanted to go to India, but he ended up in America. And then Vasco da Gama, he came to India, around the Cape of Good Hope, and that cape was so stormy that the sailors wanted to name it the Cape of Storms, but he said, no, you name it Cape of Good Hope. We will find India, and they found India. And then there was Captain Cook, who discovered Australia. There was David Livingstone, who discovered the dark continent of Africa. And there was Ferdinand Magellan, who circumnavigated the entire world. But after this exploration, the greed of the Western powers was roused. So the Spanish conquistadors went to the South America, where they destroyed the Mayan, the Aztec, the Inca civilizations. In India, the Portuguese became such a menace to the Mughal Empire that Emperor Shah Jahan was compelled to take action against them. He fought a war against the Portuguese and subjugated them. So, resistance to Western-sponsored globalization started 500 years ago. But the Western powers, they occupied nearly half of the world. They colonized half of the world. And for more than 200 years, they sucked the apple dry, literally. Wherever they went, they exploited the resources of the country to the limits. And there were two imperialist wars. Why? The First World War and the Second World War. Why? These were not for any ideology, any ideals. The wars were not fought for any ideals. The wars were fought for colonies, to capture colonies. It was purely material interests that led to these two world wars. But after the world wars, these countries, the metropolitan countries, became very weak militarily. They could no longer hold on physically to their possessions. So they decided to grant them independence. Some of the countries, however, some of the colonies, however, had to fight armed struggles even till the 70s, like Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola. There was a book, a Soviet book, Password and Guimo, in which depict the struggles of these countries. But the Western powers did not cease to have any relations with their colonies. British, for example, the British founded the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is, the Commonwealth states, all those were former British colonies were Commonwealth states. Some of them are not even fully independent. Australia, Canada, for example, have dominion status. They are dominions. They are not, because they have the Queen as the head of their state. Now, what happened? These powers, they could not physically maintain their control. Old style colonialism was no longer in fashion. So what they did, they started economically binding the countries through loans and other so-called what we will say, help. All right, so-called aid. So this led to a new form of colonialism known as neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. And then came globalization. This continued till the 1980s, end of the 1980s. You see, till the end of the 1980s, the Soviets had a very strong presence in the world. And so the Western powers, however hard they tried, they could not gain full control of the world. But after the demise of the Soviet Union, what happened is that they started a new tactics, a new strategy to take control of the world. The Dunkel proposals came, and then it was the Dunkel proposals led to the foundation of the World Trade Organization, which initiated globalization. India was forced to globalize. How? In 1990, India's balance of payments position was very bad. India was forced to take a loan from the IMF. And then the International Monetary Fund imposed on India severe terms, those which were neoliberal, so India was converted forcibly into a neoliberal economy. The Indian government was previously a welfare state, but now the government became retreating from welfare. Then India relied on a strong public sector to develop the country. But following the IMF dictates, India had to sell off many of the public sector assets to private parties. That is, privatization started. Then India was initially, after independence, India adopted a protectionist policy to protect her infant industries. India had to open the, but India had to open up under the pressure of the IMF. And as a result of this, India became a global economy. India's economy became a global economy. But the anti-globalized, but from the very beginning, India's globalization policy has been subjected to criticism. And now we find that there have been several anti-globalization movements. The first one started on January 1, 1994, with the Zapatista Army of Liberation starting in Mexico, in Chiapas, Mexico. And then we find that wherever the agents of globalization like the IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc., they have gone. The anti-globalization protesters have gone there. And they have, as a counterpoint to the World Economic Forum, they have built the World Social Forum. And the latest in the series of anti-globalization movements has been the Occupy movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement. All these spells danger for Western capitalism. Now, the West, following the pressure from their people, the Western powers are no longer finding it convenient to pursue globalization. And that is the reason why Brexit has taken place. Britain, we know, has decided to exit from the European Union. It is said that even the British Queen was in favor of Brexit. And now Donald Trump has come to power in the USA. And the first thing he has done is to ban the entry of migrants from some selected countries. And moreover, he has also heightened the wall for HIV-1 visas. Why? Because of the pressure of the people. Why? These companies, more than 100 American companies, have challenged Trump's decision to build a tariff wall similar, to make it difficult for people to obtain HIV-1 visas. Why? Because they feel it is bad for their business. But what the people, the American people, for the American people, HIV-1 visas is as good as poison. Why? Because they lose their jobs. These companies bring people who are ready to work at much lower rates than the American people. So does all this signify? We think that all this signifies a retreat from globalization. I think, in fact, some articles have already appeared in newspapers saying that globalization may be in retreat. With this, I thank you for viewing the video, and if you want to read more, please see SM11 in the EPG Pathshala, and also you can go through the references in Learn More. Thank you.